The Room is a cinematic paradox. Simultaneously considered one of the worst films ever made and an unintended work of comedic genius, it has enjoyed remarkable success since its original 2003 release. Despite being the subject of many documentaries and recently a film starring James Franco, nobody really knows how the film came to be, largely because the man behind it has staunchly refused to ever give a straight answer about almost any aspect of the film's production and its own history. That man is Tommy Wiseau, an enigmatic figure who, despite the best efforts of fans, friends, and interviewers, we know virtually nothing about. Where Wiseau was born, how old he is, and even his real name are a mystery, with what little biographical information we have about him being just the best guesses of people who've invested far more time than they care to admit deciphering the human enigma that is Tommy Wiseau. Starting with when he was born, while filming The Room, which he wrote, directed, produced, and starred in, Wiseau was asked directly by co-star and on-off friend Greg Sestero about his age, and he answered, "However old you are, Greg." It's an answer that didn't sit well with the young actor who was at the time in his mid-20s, whereas Wiseau looked to be in his mid to late 40s. Sestero, not taking no for an answer, eventually found out through Wiseau's brother's girlfriend that the raven-haired auteur was born in the 1950s. Wiseau himself has never confirmed this, masking his true age by apparently dyeing his hair, generally wearing large face-obscuring sunglasses, and adopting a punishing physical exercise regime that has resulted in him possessing a stocky, muscular frame not exactly stereotypical of a man who is supposedly in his 50s or 60s. To this day, there is no definitive answer about exactly how old Wiseau is. Likewise, we have no idea where he was born, with Wiseau himself giving contradictory, often meandering, garden path answers to the question in interviews. For example, in one interview, Wiseau explained, "I'm originally from Europe, but I'm right now American like everybody else. Long story short, I used to grow up in New Orleans, Louisiana, so people ask me, where you come from, right? So what do you want to do? Which country do you pick? I pick New Orleans." Confusing matters further is the fact that Wiseau is sometimes claimed to be from France and at other times that he actually grew up in America, or while speaking with a thick Eastern European accent. Actors working on The Room would later reveal to Entertainment Weekly that they'd made a game out of trying to figure out where Wiseau was from, and despite the combined efforts of the entire cast and crew, nobody ever got a straight answer from him. Experts studying Wiseau's accent, on the other hand, have concluded that he likely hails from Poland, which is commonly accepted by Wiseau fans. Exactly where in Poland isn't clear, but fan and filmmaker Rick Harper has suggested that Wiseau's birthplace was the Polish city of Poznan after researching the issue for a documentary on the making of The Room. This was a hypothesis confirmed in part by additional sleuthing that suggested that Wiseau's original surname was Wiseau, a fairly common Polish name, after finding the obituary records of his uncle and aunt. Again, none of this has ever been confirmed by Wiseau himself, who remains fiercely protective of information related to his life before emigrating to the United States and settling for a time in Louisiana, where he claims he has family. Education-wise, Wiseau claims to have a background in psychology as well as stage acting, the latter being especially hard to believe considering Wiseau's performance in The Room. The most mysterious aspect of Wiseau's life, though, is his seemingly unending cash reserves, with Wiseau reportedly financing the entire production of The Room out of his own pocket. A film, we should add, had a $6 million budget, which is about $8.5 million today, despite, as actor James Franco would later quip of it, looking like it cost $6, and that's something we're going to address in more detail in a moment. Prior to this, Wiseau was often observed driving around in fancy cars, wearing expensive suits, and carrying a lot of cash with him. To date, nobody has ever established with any certainty how Wiseau was able to amass so much wealth. When asked directly, Wiseau's wildly unsatisfying answer was as follows: "I tell you a little bit, but that's it. We import from Korea the leather jackets that we design here in America. If you work, you have to save money, right? I didn't get money from the sky. I was preparing. Let's put it this way." Theories about where Wiseau made his fortune have ranged from suggesting he was involved in some sort of crime ring in Eastern Europe, which doubles as an explanation for his secrecy regarding his youth, to a rumor that he was hit by a car driven by a bigwig Hollywood producer and received a generous cash payout for his silence. This one seemingly came about because of a claim by Wiseau himself, who said he was, at some point in his life, involved in a car crash in California. Alternatively, Wiseau has variously claimed in the past that he amassed his fortune through flipping property or selling jeans. Again, we have no idea which, if any of these things, is actually true. So moving back to the topic at hand, The Room began life either as a 500 or 600-page novel written some 2 decades prior to the film's eventual release in 2003. Wiseau's supposed intention was to turn the novel into a play, but he abruptly changed his mind and decided to turn it into a film instead, his reasoning being, he claims, that he did some research and found that more people watched movies than plays. Initially put forward as an independent drama depicting a love triangle between a banker, played by Wiseau, his wife, and best friend, the film is infamous for its numerous plot holes, logical inconsistencies, and inexplicable tonal shifts. Combined, these elements make the film unexpectedly hilarious, leading Wiseau to retroactively claim that the film was actually intended to be a black comedy all along. This is a claim that few believe, insisting that the film was actually just poorly made. As Testero would later write, Tommy Wiseau intended The Room to be a serious American drama, a cautionary tale about love and friendship, but it became something else entirely, a perfect, literal comedy of errors. Examples of unintended hilarity include a scene where Wiseau's character, midway through a monologue denying that he beat his wife, stops to say, "Oh, hi Mark," in the most upbeat manner possible. A short while later in the same scene, Wiseau's character laughs after hearing the aforementioned Mark recount the tale of a woman that he knew being badly beaten by her boyfriend, telling him, "What a story." In another scene, a character's mother interrupts her to casually inform her, "I got the results of the test back. I definitely have breast cancer." And to add to all of this, that plot thread is just never mentioned again. In yet another scene, the film's male cast inexplicably play a game of football while wearing tuxedos. And no, this adds nothing to the plot, it's never explained, it's not referenced again, and it's also not explained why during the scene the camera just zooms in on the character of Mark's face randomly, and dramatic music plays in the background. It's truly bizarre. When asked to explain the scene on the DVD commentary of the film, Wiseau's answer was a meandering response about playing football without protective equipment being a challenge. Minor details that likewise add nothing to the plot but fans find hilarious include the general poor quality of the film's production, as well as the fact that for absolutely no apparent reason at all, the main character has a framed picture of a spoon on his coffee table. When asked about the significance of the spoon, a cast member said that the crew simply forgot to put a photo in the frame that they had bought, and the spoon was the stock photo that was already in the frame. On that note, the overall poor quality of the film from a technical standpoint, combined with its $6 million budget, led many to instantly assume it was an elaborate money laundering scheme, with it being speculated that it couldn't possibly have really cost that much to make. In reality, the film did cost over $6 million to make, thanks almost entirely to Wiseau's seeming unfamiliarity with the basic elements of film production. For starters, Wiseau insisted on purchasing the equipment used to film The Room, rather than renting it as would be the norm for an indie director on a tight budget. Wiseau then literally doubled his filming budget by choosing to make the movie in 2 formats simultaneously, specifically high-definition video and 35mm film. He stuck the 2 cameras together on a custom rig and filmed every shot twice. He also had to have personnel to operate each camera, and then he only used the film version in the final production, making the entire secondary expense of buying digital cameras and having a crew to operate them entirely pointless. Wiseau himself has claimed that he did this purely so that he could claim to be the first director to film in 2 formats at the same time, while others have claimed he simply didn't know what the difference was between the 2 formats and bought both kind of cameras just in case. Wiseau also frequently fired and replaced cast and crew members. This was at great cost. Exactly how often this happened isn't known, and depending on which Wiseau interview you consult, he fired and replaced the entire cast and crew up to 4 times. In his own words, some of the crew members, it's correct, we changed 3 times, basically. Because they tried, for example, to change the script. They say, this is the way to do it, etc., etc. I say no. On that note, one of the cast members told Entertainment Weekly anonymously that the script had many lines that were just unsayable. I know it's hard to imagine there was stuff that was worse, but there was. Wiseau also insisted that every actor, regardless of their prominence in the film itself, had multiple understudies, and entire days of filming were wasted filming unnecessary reshoots. Scenes involving Wiseau in particular were incredibly painful to film because he'd frequently forget his own lines, a factor later attributed to nerves, and his impenetrable accent made it hard for his co-stars to understand his cues, leading to yet more reshoots. Unhappy with his own delivery, Wiseau eventually ended up redubbing most of his own lines in post-production, adding yet more more cost to the production. Wiseau also refused to let anyone see the entire script, with the sole exception of Greg Sestero, who claimed the director-actor-producer left out some amazing content. Sestero is also noted as being the only person on set who could speak Tommy's language, and he was able to prod Wiseau into cutting some of the more ridiculous ideas that he had for the film's plot, including a scene that would have revealed a character was actually a vampire the whole time by having them fly into the sky in the middle of a fistfight. Right. Wiseau also insisted on building elaborate and expensive sets for scenes that could have easily been filmed on location with the purchase of a relatively inexpensive permit. For example, to film many of the rooftop scenes, rather than going to an actual rooftop and filming, Wiseau filmed the scenes in a car park that had a city skyline CGI'd into the background at considerable expense. As for promoting the film, he spared no expense here either, though once again he did it in perhaps the least effective way possible, renting space on a massive billboard on Highland Avenue. This depicted a black and white close-up of his own face with some basic information about the film. The billboard famously stood for 5 years and led to endless speculation about how exactly Wiseau secured such a lucrative deal and how on earth he kept paying for it. As James Franco, who plays Wiseau in the film The Disaster Artist, stated, "There was an insane billboard in LA for like 5 years that Wiseau must have paid hundreds of thousands of dollars alone, and it is the scariest thing you've ever seen, with his lazy eye like staring out at you. It looks like an ad for a cult." As with most questions related to his finances, Wiseau has never explained where the money to keep the billboard standing came from, and has kept mum about how much it personally cost him, though conservative estimates say that it likely cost in excess of $300,000 for the whole 5 years that it stood. Wiseau continued to flash the cash when the film was finally ready to be released, turning up to the premiere in a limousine and a fancy suit. Reportedly crushed by the slew of negative reviews about the film directly thereafter, Wiseau dislikes talking about how much money the movie made during its initial 2-week theatrical run, but reports indicate it was around $1,200 to $1,800. Unfazed, Wiseau states, "I submitted The Room to the Academy Awards. You can check that. It's a fact. We followed all the rules by doing a 2-week run in Los Angeles, and I'm proud to be in the Academy database. After 2 weeks screening, I pulled it from circulation." Unsurprisingly, the film that was not nominated. According to Wiseau, after pulling the film, news of how amazing it was had made it a hit with local students who'd since bombarded the email address on the giant billboard we just mentioned with requests to show it again. Wiseau, confused but flattered, did just that, surmising that midnight screenings would be best so that everyone who wanted to see the film could do so regardless of their work schedule. As an aside, Wiseau believes that his choice to screen the film at midnight helped lower America's crime rate, as teenagers couldn't get in trouble if they were sat in a cinema watching The Room. And no, we really could not make this stuff up. Since then, the film has gone on to become a cult classic, and Wiseau spends much of his time traveling the globe attending screenings. Often likened favorably to fellow cult hit The Rocky Horror Picture Show, fans turn up to screenings dressed as their favorite characters and throw plastic spoons and footballs at the screen, a practice supposedly started by drunk college students watching the film during its initial 2-week run in LA. Despite being absolutely savaged by critics on release, it has had sustained and consistent success since its release, still being a staple of the midnight theater circuit over a decade later. Wiseau himself is critical of those who call The Room a bad movie, telling an interviewer in 2014, "People say bad movie. It's about how you define. How many bad movie I saw in my life? Probably dozen. But I will never say it's bad, but if I have a conversation, I say, hey, I didn't like it. This is my style. But some people say the movie it's a bad movie, and some people say, oh, it's a shitty movie. So again, it depends on how you express yourself. I don't consider The Room bad movie." Co-author of The Disaster Artist, Tom Bissell, perhaps explains it a little better and probably a little bit easier to read here. It's like a movie made by an alien who has never seen a movie but has had movies thoroughly explained to him. There's not often a work of film that has every creative decision that's made in it on a moment-by-moment basis seemingly be the wrong one. The Room, to me, shatters the distinction between good and bad. Do I think it's a good movie? No. Do I think it's a strong movie that moves me on the level that art usually moves me? Absolutely not. But I can't say it's bad because it's just so watchable. It's so fun. It's brought me so much joy. How can something that's bad do those things for me?
Looking back at the long and storied history of literature, film, and other narrative art forms, one trend becomes abundantly clear.
Writers love mental illness. From depression to bipolar disorder to schizophrenia, psychiatric disorders have been used by artists for hundreds of years to heighten drama, making heroes more heroic, villains more villainous, and allowing actors to flex their acting chops, sometimes with unfortunate real-world implications. But few disorders have captured the imagination of writers and audiences like dissociative identity disorder, or DID, better known as multiple personality disorder. Characterized by the expression of multiple distinct personality types by a single person, often accompanied by amnesia of each expression, DID has been featured in dozens of books and films, from 1957's The Three Faces of Eve and 1973's Sybil to 1999's Fight Club, 2009's United States of Tara, and 2016's Split. Given the disorder's ubiquity in popular media, one could be forgiven for thinking that DID is a relatively common affliction, or at least one well documented in the psychiatric literature. In reality, however, DID remains a poorly defined, poorly understood, and highly controversial diagnosis, with many psychiatrists questioning whether the disorder even exists at all. Accounts of people switching between multiple personalities have existed since the dawn of human history, with the phenomenon often being attributed to possession by spirits, demons, muses, and other mystical entities. However, the first medical descriptions of what we would now recognize as dissociative identity disorder would not appear until the late 19th century, the most famous being the curious case of Louis Vivet. Born in 1863 in Paris, Vivet had a miserable childhood, being frequently beaten and starved by his mother. At the age of 8, Vivet ran away from home to become a vagrant and a thief, spending most of his childhood in and out of correctional institutions. At the age of 17, while Vivet was working as a laborer on a vineyard, a venomous snake wound itself around his arm, triggering a hysterical episode and a series of violent convulsions, which resulted in him becoming paralyzed below the waist. In 1880, Vivet was transferred to an asylum and trained to become a tailor to support himself. During his stay, he continued to suffer frequent epileptic seizures until around a year later, when he suddenly regained the use of his legs. While this in itself was highly unusual, more unusual still was the fact that this miraculous recovery was accompanied by a complete change of personality. While paralyzed, Vivet had been a calm, hard-working, pleasant individual. Suddenly, however, he became rude, quarrelsome, and utterly lacking in morals. Stranger still, he no longer seemed to recognize his fellow patients or attending doctors, as though he had become a completely different person. This constant switching back and forth between two distinct personalities would persist for the rest of Vivet's life, which was spent in and out of asylums being evaluated by increasingly curious doctors. In 1882, Dr. Camusset at the psychiatric hospital in Bonneval diagnosed Vivet's condition as redoublement, or doubling, a term recently introduced by French surgeon Etienne Azam in reference to a patient he named Philida X. Like Vivet, Philida frequently switched between two distinct personality states, one serious and reserved, and one cheerful and easygoing, neither of which appeared aware of the other. The cases of Louis Vivet and Philida X fascinated the medical community and the public alike, and are believed to have partially inspired Robert Louis Stevenson's classic 1886 novella, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In any event, over the next 20 years, dozens more cases of redoublement would appear in the medical literature, with the phenomenon eventually acquiring a new name: multiple personality disorder, or MPD. French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot classified MPD as a dissociative disorder, linking it with so-called fugue states in which patients black out and wander about completely unaware of their surroundings, while Sigmund Freud made the causal link between MPD and childhood trauma. Yet no sooner had multiple personality disorder appeared in the medical lexicon did it immediately fall out of fashion. In 1908, Swiss psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler coined the term schizophrenia to describe a wide spectrum of psychotic and delusional disorders previously referred to as dementia praecox. Schizophrenia in Greek literally means split brain, and was intended by Bleuler to convey the process of the mind splitting off from reality. As Bleuler believed the development of multiple personalities to be the result of such a split, he classified MPD under the wider schizophrenia umbrella. Unfortunately, this misleading terminology resulted in a popular confusion between DID and schizophrenia that persists to this day. A second major factor in the early abandonment of MPD as a diagnostic category was the revelation that many of Charcot's alleged MDP patients were in fact frauds putting on an act for attention. Due to these and other factors, diagnoses of MPD all but disappeared from the medical literature for nearly half a century. Then, in 1957, American psychiatrists Corbett H. Thigpen and Hervey M. Cleckley published The Three Faces of Eve, a non-fiction account of patient Christine Sizemore, referred to in the book as Eve White, to protect her identity. Born Christine Costner in 1927 in Edgefield, South Carolina, Sizemore began disassociating at the age of 2 in response to a series of traumatic incidents, including seeing a man cut in half at the local lumber mill and being physically and sexually abused by her parents. She suffered from large gaps in her memory, finding herself being punished for acts of disobedience she did not remember committing and being baffled by school tests that she did not remember studying for. Later in life, she would often wake up with unexplained hangovers and an unsavory reputation at local bars. Eventually, it emerged that Sizemore's psyche had fractured into 3 distinct personalities: the shy, depressed Eve White, the extroverted, mischievous party girl Eve Black, and the pleasant and sensible Jane, the transition between the 3 often being signaled by a splitting headache. This fracture was only exacerbated by her first marriage to an abusive man, leading to an incident in which she nearly strangled her young daughter with a cord from a Venetian blind. In 1951, Sizemore began undergoing therapy with Corbett Thigpen, who noted even more bizarre aspects of a disorder, such as the fact that her different personalities possessed entirely different skill sets. For example, some of Sizemore's personalities knew how to drive, while others did not, while at one point Sizemore opened a tailoring shop in Manassas, Virginia, because one of her personalities was a skilled seamstress. The 3 personalities spoke and dressed differently, and even had different appetites, with Sizemore at one point gaining a large amount of weight as she attempted to feed 3 different people within the same body. But the amnesia so typical of MPD seemed to be strangely asymmetric. While Eve White remained unaware of the behavior and thoughts of her 2 alters, Eve Black knew everything about her host personality and delighted in torturing her. And as the therapy sessions progressed, this internal arrangement began to collapse and shift, with Eve White and Eve Black eventually disappearing, only to be replaced with a rotating cast of new alters, nearly always in groups of 3. However, according to The Three Faces of Eve, Thigpen eventually managed to dissolve and merge these personalities, and Christine went on to marry electrician Don Sizemore and live a long and happy life, dying in 2016 at the age of 89. The Three Faces of Eve became an instant bestseller, and in 1957 was adapted into a film of the same name, starring Joanne Woodward, who won the Academy Award for Best Actress for her portrayal of Christine Sizemore. But while the book and film did much to revive public awareness of MPD, its impact was dwarfed 2 decades later by the 1973 book Sybil. Written by journalist Floretta Schreiber, Sybil tells the story of an art teacher, Sybil Dorset, real name Shirley Ardell Mason, whose case of multiple personality disorder was even more extreme than Christine Sizemore's. Born in 1923 in Dodge Center, Minnesota, Mason was heavily abused by her mother, Martha Atkinson, who Schreiber speculates may have suffered from schizophrenia. According to Sybil, Martha tortured her daughter in particularly sadistic ways, such as sexually violating her with a button hook and tying her to a piano and forbidding her from urinating while she played. This trauma resulted in Mason's psyche fracturing into no fewer than 16 different personalities, including a baby named Ruthie, a writer and a painter named Marcia, a French-speaking girl named Vicky, 2 male handymen named Mike and Sid, a skilled pianist named Vanessa, a strict religious conservative named Clara, and a listless, nearly paralyzed woman named Sybil. In 1954, Mason began seeking treatment from psychiatrist Cornelia B. Wilbur, the 2 continuing to work together for 11 years. As in the case of Christine Sizemore, Wilbur eventually succeeded in bringing out a stable, confident personality named simply the Blonde and merging all the other personalities into her, effectively curing Mason and allowing her to live a happy, normal life. Like The Three Faces of Eve, Sybil became an immediate bestseller and was adapted into a 1976 movie starring Sally Field in the title role and Joanne Woodward from The Three Faces of Eve as Dr. Wilbur. In the wake of the film, which won 4 Emmy Awards, Sybil Dorset became one of the most famous psychiatric patients in history, and popular interest in multiple personality disorder exploded. While MPD had previously been one of the rarest diagnoses, with only 26 recorded cases prior to 1976, between 1985 and 1995, more than 40,000 people were diagnosed with the disorder. MPD sufferers began appearing on the talk show circuit, some exhibiting as many as 4,500 distinct personalities. In certain cases, these alters extended beyond the human, with certain individuals presenting as ducks, chickens, lobsters, tigers, gorillas, unicorns, and even angels or God.
Meanwhile, the psychiatric field scrambled to keep up with the explosion in MPD diagnoses. At the time, the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 2nd edition, or DSM-2, only briefly mentioned the disorder as a subtype of hysterical neurosis. But in 1980, thanks to a concerted lobbying effort by therapists, MPD was listed in the DSM-3 as its own distinct syndrome, which the DSM-4 later renamed Dissociative Identity Disorder. In 1984, the International Society for the Study of Multiple Personality and Dissociation was founded in Chicago, while in 1988 the dedicated medical journal Dissociation began publication. By 1990, the number of papers published on DID had increased by 6,000% since the 1970s. According to the American Psychiatric Association website, dissociative identity disorder is currently defined as the existence of two or more distinct identities or personality states. The distinct identities are accompanied by changes in behavior, memory, and thinking. The signs and symptoms may be observed by others or reported by the individual. Ongoing gaps in memory about everyday events, personal information, and/or past traumatic events. The symptoms cause significant distress or problems in social, occupational, or other areas of functioning. As the name suggests, DID is classified among the dissociative disorders, syndromes characterized by normally integrated psychological processes becoming detached from each other and from reality. The other dissociative disorders include dissociative amnesia, in which a person suddenly experiences large gaps in their memory not explainable by normal forgetfulness or other memory disorders, dissociative fugue, in which a person loses awareness of their surroundings and unexpectedly wanders off, depersonalization disorder, in which a person feels detached from their bodies or surroundings, and dissociative identity disorder not otherwise specified, or DIDNOS, a catch-all term for dissociative disorders which do not fall into any other category. All dissociative disorders are typically associated with some kind of traumatic trigger, such as childhood, physical, or sexual abuse in the case of DID. Thus, DID is widely considered to be a kind of defense mechanism, allowing the sufferer to compartmentalize traumatic memories within one or more personalities who are unaware of each other. As Cornelia Wilbur explains in Sybil, if you are too scared to face something, then it makes perfectly good sense to black out. Then you'll never have to know what you're scared of. But not everything might be as it seems. Despite DID's official recognition by the American Psychiatric Association, the disorder and its diagnosis have been long mired in controversy. Early on in the DID boom of the 80s and 90s, many psychiatrists noticed that the vast majority of purported sufferers presented almost identically to the most well-publicized DID case, that presented in Sybil, with almost none presenting with the milder symptoms of Christine Sizemore or Louis Vivet. Indeed, the average MPD sufferer was found to be very similar demographically to Shirley Mason: white, female, and around 30 years of age. This has led many to speculate that the extraordinary rise in DID diagnoses following the 1970s was a case of social contagion, with patients modeling their behavior, intentionally or not, after popular depictions of the disorder in works like The Three Faces of Eve, Sybil, and talk shows like The Oprah Winfrey Show and Jerry Springer. This is similar to how nearly all accounts of UFOs and alien abductions began following a broadly similar pattern after the release of popular alien-themed works like Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Communion in the 70s and 80s. This explanation is especially plausible given the typically extreme manifestation of the disorder in the most high-profile DID patients. If such dramatic presentations of DID were anything near as common as the talk shows claimed, the disorder would be easier to diagnose, and far more than 26 cases would have been described prior to the 1970s. But while the media has played a major role in exaggerating the prevalence of DID, the psychiatric field is equally guilty of muddying the waters. In the 1960s, psychiatrist Herbert Spiegel was asked by Cornelia Wilbur to help refine her diagnosis of Shirley Mason, aka Sybil. In the course of his evaluation, Spiegel discovered to his shock that many of Mason's alternate personalities had only emerged as a result of Wilbur's suggestions during therapy. Indeed, Spiegel found Mason to be highly suggestible, while Wilbur's methods incorporated many techniques commonly used in hypnosis. Much of Mason's disorder was thus invented during her therapy sessions, with Wilbur and Flora Schreiber, the author of Sybil, even admitting to Spiegel that Mason had to be diagnosed with MPD, otherwise their book on the case couldn't be published. Later investigations uncovered a similar pattern in the case of Christine Sizemore, discovering, for example, that her third personality, Jane, only emerged during her therapy sessions with Corbett Thigpen. In his 2012 book, The Rape of Eve, a psychiatrist, Colin Ross, describes Thigpen as unethical and exploitative, manipulating Sizemore's disorder for personal gain. Quote, at different times he functioned as a psychotherapist, publicist, literary agent, film agent, book editor, contracts negotiator, and legal advisor. He attended her husband's funeral uninvited, was her son's godfather, and engaged in sexual misconduct with her. He arranged for her to have an abortion, and during the procedure, she was sterilized without her or her husband's consent. Furthermore, contrary to the narrative described in The Three Faces of Eve, Thigpen did not actually succeed in curing Sizemore of her DID. In fact, she continued to disassociate, straining a marriage to breaking point for nearly 2 decades. It was not until 1974 that psychiatrist Tony Tsitsos managed to merge her personalities and allow her to live a normal life. These revelations, in turn, led to a major reevaluation of many DID cases, and a disturbing pattern emerged. The boom in DID diagnoses coincided with another major trend in the field of psychiatry, that of recovering repressed childhood memories. Ever since Freud, many psychiatrists have believed that people's minds are capable of repressing traumatic memories, such as childhood sexual abuse, and that through psychoanalysis, hypnosis, and other techniques, these memories can be recovered. The concept gained considerable public attention in the 1980s and 90s when expert testimony from psychiatrists claiming to have recovered their patients' repressed memories was used to achieve convictions in several high-profile sexual abuse trials. Unfortunately, it was soon discovered that the whole notion of repressed memories is, in fact, a fallacy, and that patients' supposed recollections of childhood abuse were generally false memories inadvertently planted by their psychiatrist through suggestion. You can see our video, Do Repressed Memories Actually Exist, for more detail on that. In any event, as DID is classically associated with childhood sexual abuse and other trauma, the clinical triggers of many purported DID sufferers were likewise found to be merely implanted suggestions. The debunking of repressed memories ignited a major scandal within the psychiatric community, with Harvard psychologist Dr. Richard McNally writing, "The notion that traumatic events can be repressed and later recovered is the most pernicious bit of folklore ever to infect psychology and psychiatry. It has provided the theoretical basis for recovered memory therapy, the worst catastrophe to befall the mental health field since the lobotomy era." Thus, while DID remains a recognized disorder in the DSM-5, nowadays psychiatrists are much more hesitant and selective in diagnosing it, recognizing that many of the symptoms of DID overlap with other, more common disorders, including schizophrenia, ADHD, epilepsy, and conversion disorders, and that the presentation of the disorder is very culturally specific, with many cultures who believe in spirit possession not considering the disorder to be pathological. Based on more recent diagnostic criteria, researchers estimate that DID affects no more than 1.5% of the general population. However, in a 1995 review of DID cases at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, psychiatrist Paul McHugh concluded that nearly all cases showed the hand of the artisan, meaning that at least some aspects of the disorder's presentation is directly influenced by the attending psychiatrist. The legitimacy of DID as a psychiatric diagnosis has dire real-life consequences, especially in the field of criminal law. In 1977, 22-year-old Billy Milligan was arrested and charged with the rape of 3 women on the Ohio State University campus. While awaiting trial, Milligan was diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder by psychologist Dorothy Turner. During the trial itself, Turner and Milligan's lawyers testified that one of Milligan's 10 alternate personalities had been in control during the rapes, and that Milligan himself had no memory of his actions. Based on this testimony, the judge accepted a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, and Milligan spent 10 years in psychiatric institutions, being released from the Ohio mental health system in 1988. This and other similar cases raised concerns among legal experts that false claims of DID could potentially be used by criminals to deny responsibility and avoid jail time. However, in recent years, American courts have generally rejected the admissibility of DID diagnoses as evidence on the grounds that scientific evidence fails to meet legal reliability standards and is therefore not useful to either the judge or the jury. Meanwhile, a small but dedicated group of people known as the multiplicity community is not only convinced that DID is absolutely a real phenomenon, but is fighting to have it recognized not as a disorder to be cured, but rather an alternate but ultimately healthy state of being. Within this community, bodies containing multiple individuals or personalities are known as multiplicity systems, while those with only one personality are referred to singlets. As presenting all the members of the system in public could potentially cause problems, most multiplicity systems engage in the practice of fronting, only presenting a single personality to the world as a singlet would. As the multiplicity system Falar Liang explains, we are not openly multiple. All of us disguise our behavior under one mask, one public persona, in essence appearing non-multiple to the outside eye and to most people we interact with. We're able to share memories and communicate among ourselves internally, so it's easy for us. We wear the mask well and look like your standard non-multiple person, but it can be tiring to wear the mask. Many in the multiplicity community are wary of the diagnostic label of DID, arguing that it unfairly and unnecessarily pathologizes their state of being, which they view as simply another type of neurodivergence akin to being left-handed or on the autism spectrum. They also dispute the terms identity and personality, arguing that these imply that members of a multiplicity system are not real, full-fledged individuals, but merely fragments of a larger, truer self that must be unified through psychotherapy. As multiplicity system, Anthony Temple explains, any time that a multiple group lives in fear of the consequences of coming out of the closet, they are being denied their social rights. There should not be one model of reality imposed upon everyone. Society can and should change to accept those who are different rather than enforcing a single standard of normality and punishing those who don't fit. Meanwhile, many psychiatrists consider the multiplicity community's claim that DID is a perfectly healthy form of neurodivergence to be counterproductive, discouraging many sufferers from seeking the psychiatric help that they desperately need. Thus, between this debate and the aforementioned speculation that most DID sufferers are either frauds misdiagnosed or simply being unintentionally manipulated by their psychiatrists, the jury remains very much out on how dissociative identity disorder should be defined, or whether it even exists at all. The years 2010 to 2014 saw the release of 3 Expendables films, throwback action romps starring a roster of aging 1980s action stars including Sylvester Stallone, Dolph Lundgren, Bruce Willis, Chuck Norris, Jean-Claude Van Damme, and Arnold Schwarzenegger as retired mercenaries back for one final job and presumably easy, nostalgia-fueled paychecks. While the notion of assembling a team of 60-year-olds to carry out a dangerous mission might seem like pure Hollywood nonsense, it's not as outlandish as it might appear. Faced with a potential diplomatic crisis during the Second World War, British intelligence called upon a team of real-life expendables to carry out a daring commando raid in neutral Portuguese India. This is the incredible story of Operation Creek, the last ride of the Calcutta Light Horse. The Battle of the Atlantic, which raged from the very first day of World War II to the very last, has been covered extensively on this very channel. But the desperate struggle between Allied shipping and German U-boats was not confined to the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. U-boat operations ranged as far afield as the Indian Ocean, where the marauding submarines wreaked havoc on ships sailing in and out of British India. And this deadliness only increased thanks to an unexpected helping hand. In August 1939, the freighters Rheinfels, Braunfels, and Drachenfels of the German DDG Hansa shipping line received a radio message warning them that Germany would soon be at war with Britain. The ships immediately made their way to the nearest neutral harbour, Mormugao in Goa, India. While most of the subcontinent had been colonized by Britain, Goa, located on India's west coast, some 500 kilometers south of Bombay, had been a colony of Portugal since 1510. And while Portugal had long been an ally of Britain, during the Second World War, it chose to remain neutral, its cities and overseas territories becoming hotbeds of Allied and Axis spies. The 3 German freighters were soon joined by another Axis vessel, the Italian freighter Amphora, but since all 4 were merchant ships, they were not considered a threat and were ignored by both Portuguese and British colonial authorities. Then, in the fall of 1942, Allied shipping losses in the Indian Ocean began to skyrocket, with 46 merchantmen being sunk over a 6-week period. If losses continued at this rate, the flow of supplies to Allied troops fighting in the Far East would soon be choked off. At the same time, agents of Special Operations Executive, or SOE, Britain's wartime sabotage and subversion organization, intercepted coded radio messages relaying the positions of Allied merchant ships leaving Bombay. The signals were coming from the Ehrenfels, moored in Mormugao Harbour. This discovery placed SOE in a delicate position. As taking out the Ehrenfels and its transmitter in a neutral harbour would be a diplomatic disaster, SOE agents Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Pugh and Colonel Gavin Stewart decided instead to target the network of German and Indian nationalist spies who gathered the shipping information for transmission to the U-boats. At the head of this network was the Gestapo agent Robert Koch, codenamed Trumpet, who lived with his wife Crete in Goa's capital of Panaji. On December 19, 1942, Pugh and Stewart staged staged a daring kidnapping in broad daylight, abducting Koch and his wife at gunpoint and bundling them into a waiting car. They then sped out of the city, cut the telephone lines to the border, and injected their captives with a powerful sedative before driving onto the border crossing. As one officer spoke to the border guards, the other waited in the car with the unconscious Kochs. In case of trouble, the plan was to toss a sack of rupees into the street to distract the locals, then ram the car through the gate and escape into British India. Mercifully, the guards suspected nothing, and the two agents were allowed to cross the border unmolested. The Kochs were then taken to Castle Rock, Karnataka for interrogation. The ultimate fate of the couple is unclear, with accounts differing as to whether they were released or shot as spies, but whatever the case, their abduction did little to stem the tide of U-boat attacks. In the first half of March 1943 alone, 12 Allied vessels totaling 80,000 tons were sent to the bottom of the Indian Ocean. And with that, SOE was left with only one option: sink the Ehrenfels. Given the delicate diplomatic situation, an open attack by regular British forces was out of the question. However, a covert operation by a group of trained civilians might just do the trick. To carry out this daring raid, Pugh and Lewis turned to an unlikely outfit known as the Calcutta Light Horse. Originally formed in 1872, the Calcutta Light Horse was a reserve cavalry regiment which had served with distinction during the Boer War and the First World War. By 1943, however, the unit was more a social club than a military unit, composed mainly of middle-aged, out-of-shape bankers, merchants, and solicitors, too old or unfit for regular military service. But they were all eager to see action, and their involvement would lend the raid, codenamed Operation Creek, enough plausible deniability to avoid a diplomatic disaster. In early March of 1942, Pugh approached the commander of the Calcutta Light Horse, Colonel William Grice, and revealed to him the details of the operation. Though the raid would be highly risky, he explained, since it was top secret, the men would receive no credit, no pay, no medals, and no pensions if anything went wrong. Though initially skeptical, Grice assembled his men and asked for 18 volunteers, informing them only that, "I can tell you nothing about it except that the operation should take about a fortnight and will involve a short sea voyage. There it is, gentlemen. I leave it to you. Is anyone willing to volunteer?" The 30 men assembled raised their hands. Grice then set about winnowing down the volunteers, eliminating anyone too old or ill to serve. Among those accepted for the raid was Corporal William Manners, who had lost an eye in a childhood accident and wore a glass replica in its place. When questioned about his selection, Grice simply replied, "It was good enough for Admiral Horatio Nelson. Why shouldn't it be all right for you?" In the end, 14 men from the Calcutta Light Horse were selected for the mission, the raiding party being filled out with 4 men from the rival Calcutta Scottish Regiment. This ragtag bunch of over-the-hill reservists was then put through a crash course in commando operations, being instructed in hand-to-hand combat, weapons and explosives handling, and shipboarding procedures. They then studied the blueprints of the Ehrenfels captured by SOE. The regular army drill sergeants in charge of the training were less than impressed by their over-the-hill trainees, with one complaining, "If these are the Light Horse, what must the heavy mob be like?" Nonetheless, the men dutifully completed their training and, to avoid suspicion, made their way in small groups by train to the southwestern port of Kochi, from where they would board a ship that would take them to Goa. When they arrived, however, the men of Operation Creek discovered to their shock that the ship was not a Royal Navy destroyer or even a torpedo boat, but a tiny 30-year-old steam hopper barge called the Phoebe. Used to dredge rivers and canals, the Phoebe was barely seaworthy and had to hug the Indian coast to keep from capsizing. But with British shipping in the Far East stretched to its breaking point, it was all that could be spared. Meanwhile, SOE officer Richard Lippett travelled to Goa to arrange a distraction. The attack was scheduled for the early morning of March the 9th, when the Catholic colony would be celebrating the last day of Carnival. To ensure that most of the Ehrenfels crew would be ashore and distracted, Lippett, posing as an employee of Liverpool-based shipping line John Holt & Company, persuaded the wife of a prominent German resident to hold a reception for the officers of the German and Italian ships. He also paid local brothel owners to offer a free night of services to all sailors in the harbour. Finally, he bribed local officials to ensure that both the lighthouse and buoy marking the entrance to the harbour would be inoperative on the night of the attack. And with that, the stage was set for one of the unlikeliest covert operations of the Second World War. Around 2:30 a.m. on March the 9th, 1943, the Phoebe slipped into the Mormago harbour and steamed straight for the Ehrenfels. With the lighthouse out of commission and the harbour basin bathed in darkness, the skeleton crew aboard the German freighter had little time to react before grappling hooks and bamboo boarding ladders came clattering out of the gunwales. The crew switched on the ship's searchlight, but a round from a submarine gun immediately destroyed it moments before the paunchy, middle-aged commandos of the Calcutta Light Horse came storming aboard. Faces blackened with camouflage paint, shoes soled in an inch of sound-deadening felt, and pockets stuffed with explosives, the raiders fanned out across the ship, quickly dispatching the captain and 5 crew members. One man even took a moment to drill a pistol round through a portrait of Adolf Hitler hanging in the captain's wardroom. But while the raiders had achieved total surprise, they were too slow to prevent the German crew from incinerating the ship's codebook, setting off a fire trap on her stern, and disabling her engines. They also managed to blast the ship's horn, the prearranged signal to shore in case of enemy attack. However, with Carnival still in full swing, the Portuguese authorities were slow to react. Meanwhile, the team of raiders ventured below decks and located the Ehrenfels' secret transmitter, which they reduced to scrap metal with explosives and machine gun fire. But with the ship's deck ablaze and her engines out of commission, the raiders' initial plan to commandeer or tow away the Ehrenfels had to be abandoned. She would have to be scuttled in place instead. Thankfully, the crew had beaten them to the punch, opening the ship's sea cocks to keep her out of enemy hands. Commander Bernard Davies, the captain of the Phoebe, ordered the barge's lines cast off and the boarding party to withdraw. As they did, the Ehrenfels' crew regrouped and counterattacked, only to be driven off by gunfire and blasts from a fire extinguisher. A few were tackled to the deck, handcuffed and dragged aboard the Phoebe as prisoners before the barge pulled away and steamed into the darkness. Within minutes, the Ehrenfels burst into flames and sank to the bottom of the harbour. This was followed by explosions aboard the Braufels, Drachenfels, and Amphora, whose crew, fearing Goa was being invaded by the British, decided to preemptively scuttle their ships. As she slipped out of Goa, Phoebe transmitted a single code word to SOE headquarters: Longshanks. Mission accomplished. Operation Creek was an unqualified success, with all 4 Axis ships being sent to the bottom for a loss of not a single raider. Axis crew members who abandoned ship were arrested by the Portuguese authorities and interned for the remainder of the war, local newspapers reporting that conflicts between pro-Nazi and anti-Nazis had caused the crews to mutiny and scuttle their own ships. Thus, the secrecy of the operation was maintained and diplomatic relations between Britain and Portugal preserved. More importantly, however, the raid had an immediate and dramatic effect on Allied shipping losses. In the second half of March, German U-boats sank only a single ship, the Panamanian freighter Norton. In April, they sank only 3. The Allied war effort in the Far East was now free to kick into high gear. Meanwhile, the volunteers of the Calcutta Light Horse, sworn to secrecy over their role in the raid, quietly returned to their civilian lives. Among these was Jack Breen, a partner in a life insurance firm. Upon returning to work, Breen was confronted by his partner and handed a newspaper article about the sinking of Axis ships. Acting innocent, Breen asked what that had to do with anything, to which his partner replied, "Hell of a lot. Didn't you know I'd insured the damn things? They're worth over £4.5 million. There'll be a claim, as long as your arm." Unable to speak openly about their contributions to the war effort, the men of Calcutta Light Horse instead created a secret symbol of their daring raid, a seahorse, which they included on the masthead of Gallup, the regimental magazine, and crafted into jewelry for their wives. For many years, no one outside of this exclusive group knew what the symbol meant. In 1947, following India's independence from Britain, the regiment was finally disbanded. But the motley crew of middle-aged businessmen had proven their worth to the very end, epitomizing American General Douglas MacArthur's famous maxim that an old soldier never dies, he just fades away. If Daredevil has taught us anything, it's that while a closely guarded secret within the blind community, blind people inevitably all become superheroes after losing their sight, thanks to their other senses being insanely enhanced. But when talking about the real world, does this enhancing of one's other senses really occur when the lights go out permanently? Well, for those who hate us droning on, the one-sentence answer is that absolutely yes, but also no, not at all. And this is why our videos are longer than this. You see, it turns out the universe hates things being black and white, and almost nothing is in reality, which may come as a shock to anyone who's ever read the news or used social media, ever. So let's dive in, shall we? First, let's talk about the general case. Do blind people in general have enhanced hearing and other senses? Well, the answer is no, not even a little bit, with a caveat that we'll get to in a moment that is quite fascinating. But for now, in the general case, no, the eardrum doesn't become more sensitive or any other such change in the hardware. In fact, in this general case, again with a caveat that we'll get into in a moment, nothing particular seems to change with the brain either. In fact, not just indicated by countless studies, but also for those who hate science and only believe in anecdotal accounts because, Well, that's unfortunately a thing. Blind people themselves have found that they agree with this notion and feel that their sense of hearing or touch is no better than that of a sighted person. So why do blind people seem to perceive things better with their other senses than the sighted? Well, in short, because they're paying attention and they practice like crazy simply because they have no choice. For example, when a sighted person hears a car, their natural inclination is not to try and tell from the sound how far away that car is, but to simply look and see how far away that car is. The same is true when touching something or countless other such things. When the eyes are open and looking, they are going to determine the perception of what you're experiencing. And note here, not just a perceived domination. It turns out our brain scans show that when this is happening, the brain is quite literally inhibiting activation of the areas controlling other senses. This is presumably why when you're trying to really hear something well, your natural inclination is to close your eyes. Or similarly, when you're really trying to focus on something visually, such as driving in a complex environment, you'll turn down the radio so you can see better. I'm just realizing how absurd that is, but it is something I do all the time. And speaking of that, for a sighted person, close your eyes and really listen or feel, and it turns out you'll perceive things just as well as a blind person, with the caveat that blind people become massively more practiced in various ways, and this experience can, in turn, lend to better perceived perception. For example, while if you close your eyes and hear a TV next to you, you might correctly judge approximately where the TV is and be able to point to it and say about how far away it is, a blind person would instinctively also realize that probably means there is a wall right behind the TV too, and might even be able to tell approximately how far away the wall is from the way the sound is bouncing. Further, with amazing amounts of practice judging car noises, for example, telling how far away the thing is with better accuracy becomes more and more natural without conscious thought. It's simply practice rather than the development of an ability to hear things that a sighted person can't. Perhaps no example illustrates this better than when speaking of echolocation, which many a blind person with a bit of practice gets quite good at. However, according to a 2014 survey paper, a summary of research investigating echolocation abilities of blind and sighted humans, with practice, sighted people are able to get just as good at this particular skill. Similarly, a blind person might use their cane to tap things and be able to tell what the surface is based on the sound and general feel through the cane. But this too is not a superior perception. It's just experience, practice, and, just paying attention. But all that's not very interesting. And we did promise you a caveat. And it is a super fascinating one at that. You see, it turns out for some blind people, they do gain the ability for genuine superior hearing, at least with regards to certain aspects of hearing. So, what's going on here? Well, it turns out recent research has concluded that in people blinded from birth or very early in their life, the brain actually really does rewire itself, so to speak, to process auditory and touch sensory input differently than a sighted person's brain does. The result is, for example, verifiable superior hearing, with one caveat because, again, apparently the universe just hates simplicity. To do this rewiring, the brain goes ahead and uses a portion of it that in this individual simply is going unused, with their auditory cortex essentially hijacking the visual cortex to confer what essentially amounts to more processing power for auditory input to this region of the brain. This curious phenomenon is referred to as cross-modal neuroplasticity, or more technically, it's just known as witchcraft. For a little more detail, experiments conducted at the Oregon Health and Science University have found that in early blind individuals, the medial occipital is particularly active, while these blinds from birth or early age individuals are processing the location of sounds. In a sighted person, this region of the brain is dedicated to registering visual signals by setting the threshold at which they are noticed, a function that is essentially useless in the brain of a person who cannot see. But no more, life finds a way. Interestingly, no such similar brain activity is noted in individuals who become blind at a later point in their life, which begs the question, well, why? The leading hypothesis is that in early development, the human brain is much more malleable than it is in later life, and the areas that process senses are largely connected. As a person ages and learns to process various sensory inputs, these connections are severed or weakened where unused, or where things are adapting strongly for a specific purpose. However, in a person blinded from a young age, since they never learn to process visual input properly, these connections remain intact and simply get used for something somewhat similar, but via a different sense. The net effect is verifiably better hearing for certain tasks. Exactly how much keener a blind person's hearing is in these cases, however, is not yet clear, but small-scale experiments have shown that these blind individuals can usually outperform sighted people in many hearing-related tests, such as picking up changes in pitch or the location of a sound monaural, or in layman's terms, with only one ear. That said, yet another fascinating thing is that while this adaptation comes with enhancements in some aspects of hearing, it actually seems to hurt the blind person's ability to perceive the direction and location of sound if it is coming from well above or well below them. In other words, the enhanced perception on the directional front only seems to apply to horizontal direction. Otherwise, sighted people actually perform better or as well at determining such vertical direction. Why this is the case isn't really understood at all, but it clearly shows up in testing. One more interesting thing to note here is that it turns out similar types of things occur when talking about, for example, someone who is born able to see but not hear. So this might have you wondering, if the brain is sort of rewiring itself to use a portion of itself normally dedicated for something else, what happens if you turn back on the dormant sense, such as with cochlear implants for deaf people? Well, it turns out in many cases the brain simply can't easily readjust back, and these individuals often struggle with understanding what they're hearing. That said, because this area of research is quite new, much more needs to be done to see if this can be undone in these cases with proper training programs and things like that. As contrary to a long-held perception before, it turns out even when we humans are particularly well seasoned, the brain is still surprisingly adaptable in many, though not all cases. For an example of where it can't, as we've covered before in detail when talking about deaf people, they really need to learn some complex language before the age of around 5 to 8-ish. If they do not, they often lose the ability to do so at a normal level or even have normal cognitive abilities after at all. Before complex sign languages and the like, this was largely why deaf people throughout history were thought to be mentally deficient. It wasn't that they were born this way, though. In most cases, their brains were perfectly normal. It was that their brain needed a language to function properly and they weren't taught one. Eventually, the issues with their cognitive function becomes permanent, even if you attempt in later years to teach them a language. But going back to this specific example of the brain's ability to rewire something that had already been co-opted for other uses, those who, say, could hear from childhood, lost their hearing later in life, then got it back potentially decades later, they often have no such issues with processing sounds after, as their brain did not make this sort of adaptation and has some pre-wiring still there, even if it's just been unused for some time. So to conclude, individuals who are either born blind or blinded at a very early age do in fact seem to hear better than a sighted person in many ways. Although curiously, when talking about vertical directional sounds above or below, they struggle with this or are no better than everyone else for some inexplicable reason. As for the rest of blind individuals, the perception of being able to hear better is not so much about actual superior hearing, simply that they are paying attention and are much more practiced at listening to the nuances of sounds and the implications of them. Take a sighted person and give them a bit of training, or just have them close their eyes and focus, and they are generally perfectly capable of the same thing. And now for some bonus facts. Ever wonder how deaf people think? Well, want to know more? Those who were born completely deaf and only learned sign language will, as it turns out, have an inner voice that thinks in sign language. What is somewhat more fascinating is that those who were born completely deaf but learned to speak through vocal training will occasionally think not only in the particular sign language that they know, but also will sometimes think in the vocal language they learned, with their brains coming up with how the vocal language sounds even though they've never heard it. That said, for the most part, most completely deaf people think in sign language. Similar to how an inner voice of a hearing person is experienced in one's own voice, a completely deaf person sees, or more aptly feels, themselves signing in their head as they talk in their heads. For those deaf people who are not completely deaf or wear devices to allow them to hear somewhat, they will often experience more vocal language in their inner voice in proportion to how much they can hear. Incidentally, going back to the whole not teaching deaf people a language thing, it turns out completely deaf people who are forced to use only spoken language and never taught a sign language are only slightly better off than those who know no language in terms of their brain functions. Their brains simply never fully associate spoken language they have never heard in the way sign language gets ingrained as a language, causing inner voice issues, which is necessary for our brains to process information properly. Further, learning language seems extremely integral to ability to later process abstract thoughts. These individuals do gain significantly more sense of self and better memory and the like over those who have no language. But in this stage, they will never fully reach their brain's potential, as in when they learn a sign language. As noted by Professor David Wood, a leading deaf educationalist at Nottingham University, there is still a lot of debate over what are the minimal levels of exposure needed to stimulate the language centers. But it is clear that deaf children need early experience of some sort of language if they are going to be good communicators in later life. Because of these findings, the oralist method of teaching the deaf that had endured for just under 100 years in relatively modern times is being rapidly phased out in favor of a bilingual education where sign language is taught as early as possible and vocal language is taught as a sort of secondary language to help the deaf more easily integrate with the hearing world, rather than doing it the other way around or forcing only vocal language. That said, as noted by Miranda Pickersgill, Chief of Deaf Services for Leeds Local Education Authority, bilingualism is still very much a hot potato. We have come in for a lot of flack and been accused of pushing deaf people into a signing ghetto. Yet the deaf had a big price to pay when the old methods failed. Not only could they not communicate, but they were left without a code to think in. We can no longer ignore what the research tells us. Famously a weapon of choice for legendary martial artist Bruce Lee, at least in certain films, nunchaku or nunchucks are a popular facet of pop culture. There are those who would have you believe that this humble weapon is used widely to shatter jawbones like Samson during a particularly bad hair day. But were nunchucks ever actually used in combat? After all, one is just about as likely to hurt themselves or allies around them than an enemy unless extremely well trained, and even then, it's a risk when not particularly careful. To begin with, going back to the earliest known references to this particular staple of certain martial arts, it turns out nobody is quite sure who invented it, not because its origins are thousands of years back or anything like that, but simply because, up until the likes of Bruce Lee, it wasn't really a terribly popular weapon of choice, and its history isn't well documented as a result of its relative obscurity. So, who do people think invented it? Well, it turns out even if you consult educational tomes of knowledge concerning the use of nunchucks, as we did, you'll find about as many stories as there are books covering the sticks with a little extra in the middle. A recurrent theme in the most commonly touted origin stories, however, is that its invention was spurred owing to a lack of other weapons, and thus it was an improvised weapon created from an altogether more innocuous item meant for other purposes before someone realized if you swung it, hey, you could really hurt someone, or maybe just yourself or your allies. More specifically, popular hypotheses include nunchucks beginning life as rice flails used with horses, or even wooden clappers used to attract attention during emergencies by Japanese night watchmen in feudal times. So, is there any truth to all of this? While there is much debate, starting with its use as a rice flail, the specific form we think of wouldn't have been used this way, given how you'd have to swing it to be effective at doing that job without hitting yourself anyway. That said, this doesn't rule out a different type of flail being the inspiration, as there was a type of flail used for this. It's just that one end was extremely long to keep it away from your body. So it's possible someone might have gotten the bright idea to make both ends the same short length to make for an effective weapon. As for use in horses, depending on who you consult, the nunchuck was either used as a sort of horse whip or as reins with the cord to go in the horse's mouth and the two wood pieces to hang onto. As with the rice flail idea, however, this would appear to be mostly speculation rather than backed up by any hard evidence. Getting even more specific, another common story is that the first nunchucks were created by a janitor who improvised a flail out of a broom he snapped in half and connected together with a length of chain. A variation of that tale sometimes replaces the janitor with a martial arts master who snapped his favorite training staff in half and connected the halves with a length of chain so that he could keep using it, developing a new form of fighting around the new weapon's unusual properties. unusual and bad. Much more popularly, there is a Chinese legend that after Emperor Ji Hongjun suffered a major loss to the Mongolian hordes, he and his soldiers retreated to a village. While there, they saw the farmers using a certain type of flail in the rice harvesting process and got the idea to use them as a weapon, in this case initially keeping the long ends part to make it a more effective weapon against, for example, cavalry. He then, no doubt with Eye of the Tiger playing in the background, allegedly spent a few days developing a fighting style with it, quickly trained soldiers to use it, and then, with the strength of this new weapon, managed to drive off the Mongolians. During the ensuing battle, apparently, the handles of the flails commonly broke, creating relatively equal-lengthed handle and ends, and thus the nunchaku, as we think of it, was birthed. Naturally, such ultra-specific origin tales are largely dismissed as, at best, romantic exaggeration, and at worst, perhaps completely fictional, which hasn't stopped all of them at one point or another being put forward as a definitive origin story for the weapon, even in some otherwise reputable books on the subject. So, what do we know for sure? Well, not much, but to begin with, the weapon appears to have first popped up in a documented way in Okinawa a little over a few hundred years ago. As to who came up with it, while the popular story is peasants, it's thought more likely it was the nobles there who were really the ones to popularly study martial arts at this point. More specifically, while there is much speculation, it is thought that when the nobles were barred from using such weapons like spears, swords, and guns by their then Japanese overlords, they turned to things like staff, sai, kama, a sort of sickle used for farming, and the like. At some point, someone came up with or adopted the nunchuck for use as a weapon. So this brings us to whether nunchucks were ever used during combat. While there's no evidence to suggest they weren't per se, there is a decided lack of evidence that they actually were, which is odd given other such weapons of the age do have such evidence. And even when talking just martial arts training, there doesn't appear to be any traditional katas, pre-choreographed patterns of movement used to learn how to handle and wield the weapon for the nunchuck, unlike other of these weapons such as the staff. In fact, after its invention, given history is silent on it in many ways for any other uses, it's thought likely if it was used in actual fights, it was in all likelihood mostly for street self-defense by those looking to arm themselves with an easy-to-conceal and construct weapon, rather than used by professional warriors. But even then, a weapon like a staff would be massively more effective in most cases, outside of needing to conceal that you were carrying a weapon. But even in those cases, a knife or sai would arguably be very effective and less likely for one not ultra-proficient in the use to accidentally hurt themselves or their companions with it. Noteworthy here is that when the nunchuck first seems to have popped up in well-documented history, many of the nobles were working as so-called farmer princes and merchants in Okinawa. This occurred simultaneously to a scarcity of food and an extreme rise in crime rates. Naturally, said crime was often leveled at these farmer nobles who, at the time, were not allowed to carry more traditional weapons. Thus, the speculation is that this is what perhaps spurred the use of this weapon. As the self-proclaimed nunchaku king, who accidentally has the tagline "swinging since '69", sums up, the lack of popularity for the nunchaku probably came from its low effectiveness when used against the staff or other long-reach weapons, not to mention the sword. On the other hand, one who was skilled in nunchaku usage was easily able to defeat a few opponents who were armed with knives or who were unarmed. In regards to this latter point, the actual effectiveness of nunchucks as a weapon in real fights is a rather heated argument that continues to this day, given, as you might expect, few if anybody in real life these days ever actually uses it in a real fight. Thus, without hard data, people on both sides seem somewhat indignant when it comes to admitting either the nunchuck's shortcomings or advantages as a tool to kick ass. Those who believe firmly in the power of nunchucks argue that they're a formidable and adaptable weapon in the right hands, a very true statement. The other side, however, points out that that's something you could arguably say about any kind of weapon. Even a pencil in the right hands can be extremely deadly. For example, legendary hitman John Wick once managed to kill 3 men in a bar with a pencil. So if the nunchuck was never really popular historically, how did it become so? Well, that would be 2 famous words: Bruce Lee. In more words, thanks to this particular weapon's showmanship, for lack of a better word, and Bruce Lee's prodigious skill with it. This combo saw it become a favorite for choreographed fight scenes featuring martial artists. It simply had cinematic appeal, similar to countless other fighting techniques and styles that someone who actually knows what they're doing would never do, as many of these would would be a good way to stop living if were actually used in real life. Perhaps the most famous and egregious thing depicted on this note is basically any sword fighting method ever depicted in almost every single Hollywood sword or lightsaber battle. In film, it's about what looks cool, not what would actually be effective at killing someone. As a result of all of this, the humble nunchuck became more popular than it arguably ever had been in history in the mid-20th century, when Bruce Lee decided to show off what a master at wielding one could do with it in a choreographed fight. The result was not just general public fascination, but even many martial arts forms started adopting the nunchuck because, well, what better way to get kids to pick up martial arts than mimic badass martial arts stars in Hollywood? On that note, because of the fact that nunchucks, more than any other weapons, pose as much danger to the person wielding them as a potential attacker does until a certain level of mastery is achieved, this has led to the weapon being banned in several countries, even when other far more deadly weapons are still perfectly legal. In fact, nunchucks were even banned, at least from being shown on TV in the UK in the 1990s, out of fear kids would try to make their own and slap themselves upside the head with them. Which, to be fair, is something that absolutely would happen. Indeed, further in the UK, in the show Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Michelangelo's iconic nunchucks were censored and replaced with a grappling hook called the Turtle Line, which was also featured in merchandise and the like for this character instead. Beyond a censorship of nunchucks, the BBC also changed the name of the show to Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles. You see, ninja was deemed to have too violent of connotations. If you're wondering, a substitute for ninja in the 1987 TMNT song in the UK, among certain other countries, was not hero, but rather as follows. Splinter taught them to be fighting teens, as apparently teaching them to be fighting teens was less violent than teaching them to be ninja teens.
If you've never seen the movie A Knight's Tale, the Cliff Notes version of the story is that Heath Ledger's character, William Thatcher, pretends to be a knight to compete in various jousting competitions across Europe for fame, fortune, and the love of a woman. Since Thatcher is a peasant, in order to compete, he claims to be a knight called Ulrich von Lichtenstein, who hails from Gelderland. While in the film Thatcher comes up with his knightly alter ego more or less off the cuff, in reality the makers of the movie seem to have given it a lot more thought. You see, while Ulrich von Lichtenstein isn't well known today, he is a historic knight and poet who wrote various notable works concerning medieval knights and noblemen, particularly focusing on how knights should behave. From Ulrich's autobiographical poem Frauenbuch, The Service of Ladies, it would also seem that the Ulrich von Lichtenstein depicted in A Knight's Tale had a lot in common with his real-life namesake. Frauenbuch was written by Ulrich sometime around 1250 AD, about 25 years before his death in 1275. Ulrich is also mentioned in passing in several books about jousting, with it being inferred that he was particularly gifted at the sport, among other knightly endeavours. Based on his own description of his exploits, he was also a little flamboyant. It isn't clear how much of Frauenbuch is based on actual events and how much was made up for the benefit of the story, which illustrates the knightly ideal of always loving and honouring one's lady. But as you'll soon find out, it's fair to say that major elements of the tale were probably fictional. Like his Hollywood counterpart, in Frauenbuch, Ulrich claims much of his jousting exploits were inspired by a woman, in this case an older, higher-ranking noblewoman the young knight became smitten with in his early teen years when he was serving as a page. Although the married noblewoman constantly rebuffed young Ulrich's advances over the years and even openly made fun of his appearance due to his hair lip, Ulrich decided to keep trying to win her over anyway. He states that his obsession with this woman was so great that it often sneak into her room at night to wash his hands in her bath water, and he'd even occasionally drink it. When Ulrich reached his late teens, he found that he had a talent for jousting, among other knightly sports, and he began entering tournaments, wearing his paramour's colours, dedicating his many victories to her. When this failed to win over the object of his affections, he subjected himself to dangerous surgery to correct his hair lip, which must have made him look a little better because soon after recovering, flattered that he would do such a thing for her, she invited him to accompany her and others on a horse ride. However, when he was riding alongside her, he was too nervous to say anything, and the noblewoman tore out a lock of his hair as a sign of her displeasure over his behaviour. After this disastrous encounter, Ulrich's crush refused to have anything to do with him, and for 3 whole years she wouldn't acknowledge him or the dozens of poems or songs he wrote for her. She also barred him from wearing her colours in the various tournaments he took part in. A turning point came in Ulrich's life when, during one of his many jousts, his finger was severely injured, and he wrote to the love of his life to tell her this. She wrote back to Ulrich accusing him of exaggerating the injury. After reading this reply, Ulrich cut off his injured digit and sent it to her. Amazingly, this Van Gogh-esque stunt worked, and Ulrich's love interest was flattered when she received the savaged finger and responded that she would cherish his digit and look on it as a daily reminder of his dedication to her. Back in her good graces, Ulrich was once again granted permission to compete in her name. Keen to win over his love permanently with a major act of bravado and flamboyance, Ulrich embarked on a massive jousting spree from Venice to the borders of Bohemia while dressed as Venus, the goddess of love, dubbing the whole endeavor Venus's Journey. Over the next 5 weeks, Ulrich competed in hundreds of jousts against anyone who wished to challenge him, all well dressed like a woman and declaring his undying love for his lady. Needless to say, there were more than a few who laughed at him during his exhaustive tour, but he claims to have broken 307 lances against his opponent during the Joust Fest, versus only 271 managing to do the same to him. This journey resulted in the lady inviting him to dress like a leper and wait outside her castle with the other beggars who wished an audience with her. This Ulrich did. Even still, upon his arrival, rather than greet him, she promptly went to sleep for the night and left Ulrich standing outside in the rain, only sending word the next morning for him to climb up to her window using a rope she dropped down for him. When Ulrich tried to ascend the rope after wading across a moat, she cut it and he fell into the water below. Now, you'd think that after all of this, Ulrich would get the message that this girl wasn't interested in him, nor really worth pursuing. But like his namesake's character in A Knight's Tale, he soldiered on trying to win the heart of an apparently fickle, spoiled brat of an individual, not unlike the character of the noblewoman Jocelyn in A Knight's Tale, who seems to have little more than looks going for her. Heath Ledger's character, by the way, should have definitely gone with the blacksmith Kate as the object of his affection. She was arguably just as pretty as the noblewoman he was after, if not more so, but much more importantly, the blacksmith was also intelligent, independent, hardworking, exceptionally skilled at her trade, which was also a useful one for a knight, down to earth, and not an entitled, spoiled brat in any way, shape, or form. Just May? In the end, Ulrich decided to tell his crush that he'd be leaving to go on a crusade for her. This finally did the trick, winning his lady love's affections. We can only hope that it was worth it and that our higher-stationed husband didn't just have the young upstart killed for having an affair with his wife. Of course, Ulrich also notes in his supposed autobiography that he was actually married himself and even visited his wife for a time during the saga. When he did so, he found that she was doing a bang-up job of managing his estate and raising his children while he was off gallivanting around doing chivalrous and knightly things like trying to win the heart of a noblewoman, and presumably also having his way with many a wench along the way to celebrate his victories on the pretend battlefield. So how much of Ulrich's autobiographical poem is true? Well, nobody knows, but it would seem extremely likely that at the very least a fair amount of it was exaggerated, or more likely in some cases made up completely to make the story more interesting and to drive home the central message Ulrich was going for. Also, it's entirely possible that the noblewoman in the story is a fictional plot device illustrating the chivalric concept of serving and honoring one's lady in all things, no matter what. Of course, his own wife, who he was wholly neglecting during this time, was also a noblewoman, so he obviously wasn't sending any mixed messages. Ulrich's adoration of all noblewomen was aptly described at the very beginning of Frauenbuch. I greet the ladies one and all, though my reward was ever small. For serving them, I must confess, what wealth of virtue they possess. They're all the world can have of bliss, for God made nothing else like this. A noble woman, that is why my praise of them must be so high. As for the verifiable facts about Ulrich, he seems to have been from a minor but prosperous noble family born around 1200 AD in the Duchy of Styria, in the south of modern-day Austria. He started out as a page in his early teen years and then became a squire to Margrave Henry of Istria, the son of Duke Berthold IV of Merania. He was ultimately made a knight by Duke Leopold VI of Austria in his early 20s. We also know that he became a high-ranking commander and a provincial judge in his later life. He was also the proud owner of 3 castles. Ulrich was a knight during a time of relative peace in the region he lived during the 13th century. This spurred on an awful lot of idle time for knights who tended to like to fill it, practicing their skills in tournaments that had various competitions, including mock army battles, sometimes with archers and all. In some cases the weapons were blunted, though deaths did occasionally happen in the tournaments. Given this, it seems very likely that Ulrich did at the least attend and compete in a host of tournaments, and it seems as if he was relatively skilled at these endeavors. Beyond his martial skills, his various written works strongly indicate he was very well educated, and of course an uncommonly skilled poet and writer.